And I would like to point out that Johnny Cash is in fact Bob's long lost cousin, not the other way around. And once once we get the PowerPoint up, I'm more than happy to go.
Excuse me, can you tell us, or should we be asking questions as she goes through the presentation, or just wait to the end? How would you like to facilitate this?
So we will be pausing for about 5 minutes in the middle of the presentation, and we'll answer a few clarifying questions. Otherwise, we will be doing a Q&A at the very end, kind of time dependent. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get through everybody's questions within or by the end of the night. All right.
Also, Lynn just reminded me, you all haven't had a chance to introduce yourselves. So Lynn, Raleigh, and David, if you want to introduce yourselves as well, I'm sorry about that. I always forget this part, the most important part. Raleigh, Lynn, David.
I'll go first. Hello, everybody. I'm Raleigh Iverson. I was and kind of still am in certain strange ways on Jennifer's team and part of the team that has spent effectively the past year looking to community benefits agreements. I believe this is our third workshop, and each one has been even better than the last. So we're excited to be here and excited to have a chance to talk to you all.
Hi, my name's Lynn Groft. I am a third-year law student. I worked on this project since last August and very happy to be here with you tonight.
Hi, I'm David. I think I'm the only one who got the chance to introduce myself already, so I will just reiterate, very excited to be here. Thank you again.
All right, we all set? Good, Jennifer?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. So as Jennifer previously mentioned, last year we researched ways that community benefit agreements, or CBAs, can be used by communities as one of several tools to promote more equitable development across DC. For the purposes of today's workshop and our research more generally, we define CBAs as legal contracts between community members and the developer of a specific site. Under a CBA, community members agree to provide their support for a development project, and in exchange, the developer agrees to provide certain benefits and amenities back to the community. As Jennifer also mentioned, our team has developed a toolkit of resources for ANCs and other community members who may be interested in the CBA process. Those tools are currently being finalized and will be made available on the Harrison Institute's website later this winter. But for today, we'll spend approximately 20 minutes explaining how CBAs work, which we know may be a bit of a review session for some of you. We'll pause for 5 minutes to take any clarifying questions that you may have, then move on to some best practices for developing CBAs, and then we'll end with a Q&A. A quick word on our research methodology. To better understand how CBAs work in practice and not just on paper, we've done a survey of CBA case studies, primarily in DC, but we've also done a few in other cities. Most importantly, we interviewed over 36 individuals who have experience negotiating CBAs. The majority of the individuals we spoke to represent community interests, but we also spoke to some representatives from development teams and from DC government in order to provide as objective and useful an analysis as possible. Some of their names are seen here. We did not include the names of any individuals who asked to speak off the record. I'll pause for a moment and let everybody skim the list. All right. We also want to acknowledge and thank everyone who took the time to fill out our pre-workshop survey. So we're going to kick things off by sharing with you some of the results from the survey to get a better sense of who is in the room today and the priorities that you all have identified for Ward 4. When we asked how you define community, you mentioned a range of shared experiences, such as a shared physical space or geographic proximity. You mentioned people or each other. And finally, you mentioned shared values and beliefs, such as through a social group or a group of life forms. When discussing assets, we heard you mention faith-based organizations like the Petworth United Methodist Church and the Emory Beacon Church. You also mentioned community organizations like the Upper Georgia Avenue Association and the Petworth Get Wise Coalition. Mutual aid groups came up numerous times. You mentioned your neighbors, recreation and cultural spaces like Rock Creek Park and the Lemon Riggs Rec Center. You also mentioned schools. And finally, when we asked you for the changes or the improvements that you'd like to see in your communities, you primarily mentioned jobs, small business development, recreational resources, increased support for senior citizens and the unhoused, among other concerns. Some of you also had strong feelings about Walmart. I will now pass it over to David, who will get us started with how a community benefits agreement could help elevate some of these priorities in Ward 4.
Thanks, Raleigh. So to get us all on the same page, we thought it might be helpful to go through a high-level overview of what CBAs are. Based on the results of the survey, exactly half of you indicated that you've heard of CBAs but don't know much about them, while the rest of you are somewhere between very familiar and never heard of them. So we wanted to spend a few minutes getting everyone on the same page with an overview. As Raleigh mentioned at the outset, a CBA is a legally binding contract that is specific to a particular development project, and it is a promise by developers to deliver community benefits, such as affordable housing, green spaces and park facilities, local hiring standards, and job opportunities. In exchange, it is also a promise by community representatives to publicly support a planned development project. We'll talk more in a moment about the process of forming coalitions for that purpose. It is also really important to note how CBAs differ from other kinds of development tools. So on that note, CBAs are not the same thing as oral statements made by developers about the impact of their new projects. So for example, in the pre-workshop survey, some of you expressed concerns about the enforceability of agreements made with developers. We have often heard that previous ANC commissioners have gotten verbal agreements from developers about new projects, but the developer never ended up delivering. And then in the end, there was no consequence because the agreement was never put into writing. So if a developer promises that a new project will, for example, create new jobs, but they don't commit to that promise in writing, then it's not a CBA. CBAs are also distinguishable from obligations that developers already need to fulfill as a matter of law. So for example, complying with the district's comprehensive plan or the inclusionary zoning program is not a CBA. CBAs are complements to this kind of legal requirement. They're not substitutes for them. So to put it another way, CBAs are ways to get developers to deliver benefits on top of what they have already required to provide by law. CBAs should also be distinguished from traditional development agreements, meaning deals made between the district and a private company for the development of a parcel of land. Part of what makes CBAs unique is that they give community members, and not just the local government, a direct hands-on role in shaping the outcome of a specific project. And that's another thing that makes them different from development agreements or the comp plan, where community members can lobby the district government to secure certain benefits, but community members won't get final approval on the specifics of the project, unlike they would with a CBA. So if that's what CBAs are, then who makes CBAs happen? Well, there are several key stakeholders in the process. In summary, they include, first, community representatives like each of you, who are the engines throughout the CBA lifecycle, from building a coalition of representatives to negotiating with developers to ensuring that the terms of the agreement are followed through. In DC, a community can be represented, for example, by an ANC, who could also be joined by a larger coalition of representatives that can include one or more community-based organizations. We will get back to the role of the ANC and community organizations shortly. So community representatives can directly negotiate CBA terms with developers. They can implement public campaigns to pressure developers into delivering benefits, and they can also monitor compliance of CBAs, including enforcing the terms of the agreement. Likewise, by definition, developers also play an important role. Developers negotiate CBAs with community representatives, and they are responsible for fulfilling their commitments to the community as laid out under the terms of the CBA. Community representatives and the developer are the primary parties to a CBA agreement, but there are also other stakeholders who can play a supporting role. The role of DC government in the CBA process varies by project, as well as whether agencies are trying to encourage a particular outcome or remain neutral. So for example, the Zoning Commission generally doesn't weigh in on CBA negotiations, but they do require that applications for planned unit development, or PUD, include a public benefits and amenities package that is commensurate with the requested zoning variance. By contrast, DC council members have explicitly conditioned their approval for a project based on the developer's willingness to negotiate a CBA. We saw this with the Southwest Soccer Stadium CBA in 2014. And we know from our interviews with the Office of Planning that they are willing to provide support to community representatives and answer questions about the land use and planning processes. Finally, communities may want to seek out those who can provide technical assistance. For example, legal support for looking at a draft agreement, or local policy experts who can conduct economic analyses of a project's potential economic impact on the surrounding community, and maybe also of the CBA's economic value, or the number of affordable housing units that's realistic to ask for. We will return to these key players in the second half of the presentation when we get to best practices. But for now, we'll move on to some examples of CBAs to demonstrate what all of this looks like in practice. So I'd like to share 4 examples from recent years, which some of you might already be familiar with. Of the many CBA examples in DC, we chose these 4 because each one illustrates an important lesson that we want to highlight. The first example is a recent CBA in Ward 4, which some of you may be familiar with, Riggs Park Place, which was signed in 2019 and negotiated by the Lamond Riggs Citizens Association and the developer, FT Associates. This was in connection with the mixed-use development on South Dakota Avenue. The community benefits included a total of $285,000 in financial contributions, which included $20,000 for education and workforce development training, $50,000 for small business capacity building services, $50,000 for college scholarships for local students, and $200,000 for public space improvements, such as seed funding for a Main Streets program. An additional $40,000 was also provided for community development improvements for local organizations, such as the Riggs LaSalle Rec Center, Lamond Riggs Library Friends, and the Lamond Riggs Citizens Association, which received funding for its newsletter and website administration. To provide some context for how this CBA compares to other CBAs that have been negotiated in DC, we also thought it might be useful to demonstrate a few CBAs in other wards. The Entertainment and Sports Arena CBA was negotiated between Events DC and the ESA Community Benefits Coalition back in 2017. This related to the construction of the Entertainment and Sports Arena, also known as the ESA, near St. Elizabeth's East in Ward 8. The community benefits promised by the developer here included $60,000 per year in scholarships for Ward 8 youth, as well as support for local businesses and hosting up to 5 community service events per year, like the MLK Day Parade and Peace Walk. This CBA is really important because it involved a broad community coalition that incorporated the feedback from hundreds of Ward 8 residents. Next is the Broadcast CBA. So this was negotiated between a developer, the Wisconsin Owner LLC, and ANC3E. This related to the construction of a $75 million mixed-use development in Tenleytown. The community benefits included 10% affordable housing set-asides for residents earning up to 60% of the area median income, a donation to the National Park Service to renovate facilities for community use, streetscape improvements like landscaping, streetlights, bike racks, and benches, and promises with respect to site use and design, such as limiting construction hours and traffic mitigation efforts. This is a noteworthy CBA because the ANC who negotiated the agreement is a lawyer, and that's important for us because it showed us it really showed in some of the enforcement language which was adopted in the CBA. We're going to elaborate on this a little bit more in some of our forthcoming resources, like the CBA model template. And finally, the Progression Place CBA, which was negotiated between Broadcast Center partners, not to be confused with the same name of the name of the CBA in Ward 3 we just mentioned, and a community coalition led by One DC. This CBA was connected to the construction of Progression Place, a mixed-use development in Shaw. The community benefits included affordable housing set-asides, below-rate space for local businesses, and the establishment of a community benefits fund whose uses were decided by neighborhood residents. This is a really important CBA because it succeeded in securing the delivery of some, but not all, of the benefits that the Community Coalition was trying to get. And that mixed record is really helpful for our purposes because it shows CBA's potential as well as their limits when CBAs are not enforced. So in totality, these examples only provide a really brief glimpse of the role that CBAs have come to play in the DC development world over the past several years, both in Ward 4 and in other parts of the city. In the next section, we're going to discuss the best timing for negotiating a CBA. What's the right time for communities to negotiate a CBA? Just to recap all of this. So yeah, to recap, what makes CBAs unique is that they give community members a direct role in development by attaching specific community benefits to new projects and negotiating directly with developers, and then holding developers accountable for those promises. So to tell you more about when and how it is possible to negotiate CBAs, I'm going to pass things over to Lynn.
Thanks, David. So in this next section, we'll go over when CBAs come into play in the development process and how two parties, the developer and community members, could benefit from negotiating a CBA. The timeline for any development project can vary widely from the time that a project is announced to project approval, and then to when the construction is completed and the certificate of occupancy. But regardless of that timeline, CBAs are typically negotiated before the project receives the final okay from the zoning commission or the council for whatever approvals the project needs. This is primarily because communities may not have the same opportunity to negotiate with developers once the zoning commission approves the project. Once the agreement is finalized, the Community Coalition provides its support of the project for any necessary approvals, such as those needed from the zoning commission or the council. The developer often begins to deliver those community benefits then during the construction phase and may continue to do so after the project is completed. So to give a more concrete example of what this actually looks like, I'll use the entertainment and sports arena CBA, which David just mentioned as an example. So for this project, it all started in September of 2015 when DC government and Events DC announced a partnership to construct the sports arena. However, Events DC was not doing proper community engagement, and they were on track to fail to bring the project to fruition. In response, Congress Heights Community Training and Development Corporation began to coordinate a community coalition to negotiate a CBA with Events DC. The next April, the first of a series of public meetings were held to engage members of the community to negotiate a CBA. And then over the next 6 months, 33 community organizations and more than 300 individuals met and identified community benefits to demand of Events DC. After the ensuing negotiations, the CBA was finalized in December of the following year. And as part of the CBA, the Community Coalition then provided letters and testimony in support of the arena project prior to the necessary approvals. They also worked with Events DC on a collaborative media strategy to promote the ESA development. And some of the benefits negotiated in the agreement were delivered during the construction phase, while other benefits were not delivered until after the completion of the ESA construction. And some of these benefits will continue to be delivered for many years to come. For example, there was a scholarship fund with recurring contributions from Events DC that will be made for a 19-year period. So given this timeline, what makes negotiating a CBA worth it? Well, for the developers, the bottom line is that developers need the community's support when they are building a project. Support can come in several ways. The primary benefit that a CBA provides to a developer is community support. Developers need zoning and permitting approvals to build a new development. For example, one of the most common approvals that developers request and which ANCs will frequently interact with are planned unit developments. which David mentioned a little bit earlier. Developers request PUDs when they want to build a project that does not conform with existing zoning requirements. During the PUD approval process, the Zoning Commission gives great weight to the written testimony of ANCs in the project area. And if the ANC supports the project, that can help clear the way for the project to be approved. And in order to get that support, the developer will often be willing to negotiate a CBA. A developer also needs community support when it seeks approval for large public subsidies like tax abatements that have to be approved by the council. And public hearings may also accompany the approval process. So the developer may seek out the community support beforehand in order to avoid outspoken community opposition later on at the hearings. We also know that if a project appears to be unpopular with residents, the council members themselves may encourage a developer to negotiate a CBA in response to political pressure from their residents. So since community opposition in any of these situations can cause significant delays to a project, developers often proactively seek out community support through a CBA. And in fact, what we've heard is that many developers in DC expect to negotiate a CBA when they build a new project, especially a larger one. And this relates to another prominent point that came up in our interviews, which is the idea of risk for developers. Developers want to eliminate as many sources of risk as they can. So when community members raise opposition after construction has begun, it can lead to costly disruptions, may even lead to a stop work order, which we saw in Ward 8 last year. And for developers, we know that time is money. So they want clarity from the community as much as possible before construction begins in order to avoid these types of protests that we've seen in past projects. We heard directly from a developer and is probably of no surprise to anyone here. So those are some of the reasons why developers would be interested in CBAs. So then why should a community negotiate a CBA? Well, a CBA can offer several opportunities to community members. For one, a CBA can help a community directly address concerns about potential negative impacts of development. In your survey responses, some of you expressed concerns about rising housing costs, which can be accelerated by new development and gentrification. And communities have successfully used CBAs in DC to address that concern by securing additional housing that's affordable and accessible to families. We've also heard concerns from many of you about other longer-term issues that are not directly related to development projects, like lack of employment opportunities. Communities have used CBAs to secure commitments from developers to fund a job training program or to hire within local neighborhoods for permanent living wage jobs in new retail spaces that were being built, for example. So technically, CBAs can be negotiated as just a one-off agreement that's reactive to development. And some CBAs in DC certainly have been that way. But ultimately, CBAs can help achieve community development goals by being proactive to development. We heard over and over again that it is better to have a sense of what the community needs before being approached by a developer with a CBA, so that the community can control the outcome before the process starts moving too quickly. So that may include having meetings and conversations like this one today. The process for developing a CBA in and of itself can also help to unite advocacy coalitions that end up working together on future CBAs in the same community without needing to reinvent the wheel every time there's a new CBA. And finally, I know some of you have mentioned in the survey that there have been developers who verbally agreed to something, but never put it in writing, and so they didn't deliver. And that problem is exactly why CBAs exist. Because with CBAs, communities have the ability to hold the developer legally accountable for their commitments, and as much as possible to create a win-win situation for both community members and developers. So we hope we've been able to be clear about the benefits of CBAs for both communities and developers. And there are always trade-offs. CBAs may bring some drawbacks, and so I do want to highlight those, but I also want to share how communities have been able to address these potential obstacles. So first, if not enough people are brought into the community coalition, the narrow interests of a few rather than the broader community interests could end up kind of dominating the process. And so to address these concerns, communities can bring together a diverse coalition that represents various interests in the community. We've also heard concerns from some residents that if they demand too much from a developer, then that might discourage developers from building a project in their neighborhood at all. And we know that many residents don't necessarily want to stop all development. They just want to make sure that whatever development does happen is going to be advantageous to the surrounding community. But as I mentioned before, developers need the community's approval. And so any resistance from the developer may just be a negotiating tactic. And by showing up to public meetings and hearings, communities will be able to demonstrate the power of their coalition. And at the end of the day, what we've just really heard over and over again is that most developers will sit down and negotiate. As I'm sure you all know, it takes time and resources to bring together a very diverse coalition and then to negotiate with a developer and implement the agreement. But a diverse coalition can also bring different areas of expertise and create a clear organizational structure to help make the process more manageable. And finally, once the CBA is negotiated, enforcing it can be a challenge. The community coalition has to be willing to hold the developer's feet to the fire if needed. One of the most important best practices that communities use is getting the terms of the CBA adopted as part of a zoning order or some other regulation. This is actually really common with CBAs in DC, particularly with planned unit developments, because this puts the zoning commission in a position where they can help enforce the CBA against the developer. It's not just on the community. And finally, many developers emphasize to us that a well-drafted CBA can be a win-win for both parties, which means that it's in the best interests of both the community and the developer both around their commitments. So we hope that this has been helpful in outlining when and why developers and communities may want to negotiate a CBA. And we'll share some additional best practices in just a bit in our next section. I'm going to pass it back to Raleigh so we can take a little break for questions.
Thanks, Lynn. So we are now a little bit more than halfway through our presentation. So far, we've covered what a CBA is and when a community might consider pursuing a CBA. If you are already familiar with CBAs, we thank you very much for your patience. Before we move on to explore some best practices that we've learned over the course of our interviews, we want to pause and take any questions about what you've heard so far. As some individuals already have, please feel free to place those questions in the inbox or in the chat box, sorry, or feel free to raise your hand. Let me see, we have a few already. Ms. Jefferson asks, you mentioned these as successful CBAs. What type of validation has occurred to find out whether the benefits were actually realized and materialized? If I'm understanding the question properly, the majority of our research and majority of our understanding regarding whether or not the benefits were actually delivered stems primarily from our interviews with individuals and different parties who were actually involved in both negotiating, creating the CBA, and tracking its enforcement. If that's not responsive, please let me know. Lynn or David, do you have?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, Raleigh, is I mean it's hard, honestly, to tell whether or not a lot of the benefits have been delivered with a lot of these CBAs, which is a little bit part of why one of our resources that we've been working on developing is a CBA database. And part of that is sort of trying to keep track of what commitments have been made so that there can be a little bit more accountability. A lot of it is just sort of, we've learned it from talking to the communities that negotiated the CBAs, whether or not those terms have been delivered. And depending on the project, some of these CBAs, all of the benefits were delivered before the certificate of occupancy was issued and the project's been completed, so they've gotten their benefits already. Some of the other CBAs are still in progress, or They have benefits that will continue to be delivered for, in an ongoing process. So it sort of varies case by case. And you want to say something, Jennifer?
David, do you have anything to add? I also have an additional thought, but David, I wasn't sure if you wanted to weigh in as well.
No, I think that Raleigh and Lynn covered it pretty well.
Yeah, and so for this question, if we've understood it correctly, Ms. Jefferson, I think one of the things that we've also seen is not only is the impetus on the developer to make sure that benefits are delivered, there's also responsibility for the community representative, whether it's an ANC or a negotiating coalition, to make sure that the residents who can benefit from the benefits or amenities actually know about the outcome. We saw this at with a particular CBA in Ward 7, no names or no projects will be named here, but essentially the residents didn't know that there had been funding that the developer had made available to those residents. So a lot of it has to do with kind of just keeping lines of communications open. And I think the students during the second half of the presentation have some suggestions for that around, for example, having an implementation committee and just making sure that you have a diverse coalition. I think we said that over and over again over the course of the presentation, because it's difficult for one ANC who's a volunteer and has many other jobs and hats to wear to kind of be held accountable for all of that. And so in the spirit of transparency, I think that's why we always go back to making sure that there's a diverse coalition of many people to hold the developer and their ANC accountable at the end of the day. Why don't we go on to the next question, which is, I think, why encourage ANCs to enter into contracts when they cannot sue to enforce them? Going backwards, David, Lynn, or Raleigh, do you guys want to take a stab at answering that?
Sure. We actually are going to slightly defer that to this. What was that? We're going to slightly defer that to the second half, just because a large portion of the second half of our presentation will be touching on that exact topic. But just in short, essentially ANC's great rate is one of the most important aspects of CBA negotiation. But again, we'll expand on that later in the presentation.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
I was trying to understand and keep in mind what a CBA is, and I know it's a binding contract between a community and the ANC. Is that, am I in tune?
So a CBA is typically a contract between an ANC or a community coalition, some form of representative body for a community, and a developer who is building something in that community.
Right. Okay. So my question is, if a developer comes into a community where there is a resident next door to their development, like a commercial, a resident and a developer building a club next door to a resident's home or an apartment, is a CBA useful there, or has it been discussed with the ANC or the community? Or I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. My question is, if I live in a 50-unit building and a developer builds a nightclub direct next door to where I live, and I'm being disturbed from my rest at night and my evenings of relaxation and watching TV because of this club, what can I do about it?
I could be incorrect, and I'll defer to Lynn and David here, but I don't know that a CBA, at least in the situation that you described, is the proper avenue to rectify the situation. But again, Lynn or David,
Would the club owner be considered a developer if he designs and builds a club next door to my residence?
Yeah, so what really I think would be the question here would be whether or not is this a project that is this a club that is in the process of being built, or is it already been built and it's already operating? So CBAs are a tool that can be used while a project is being built. The actual building is going through a zoning or permitting approval process, because the CBA is really, that's where communities really have kind of a leverage point in terms of getting sort of benefits. And we have seen in some cases CBAs where they set, because if they knew who the tenants were going to be, they were able to set some restrictions based on how that space would be used. For example, I mean, this is a slightly different context, but in Southwest DC, when the soccer stadium for DC United was being built, they set kind of regulations around not only like traffic and but also like when games would be held, to kind of manage kind of community relations. And there are also sometimes CBAs have been used to prevent certain types of businesses from being tenants in a particular development. But if we're talking about a case where there is already a business that's currently operating, then a CBA wouldn't be the avenue to address that. I think that would be going through kind of DC government kind of agency processes there.
Well, what I'm speaking of, the developer came in long after I had lived here. Let's say, like, for example, I lived at my residence for 15 years. And then one day, without warning, a club opened. I mean, it happened just like that. Here's a club, people going in, partying, doing this and that. So no signs and no warnings about there was about to be a club next door to where you live, where your bedroom is. You're going to hear a lot of noise from 4 o'clock in the evening to maybe 4 o'clock the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And no warning to that. And I called my ANC person. This was like about 7 years ago. And they told me it was nothing that they could do about it, because I lived in a commercial area.
Right.
I think
Even though I was a resident next door to a club, the area was mixed, residential and commercial.
I think Miss Margaret, hi, I'm sorry, this is Paul Johnson. I happen to be at ANC actually, and as you know, and I think like it sounds like that tool of settlement agreements and interaction with ABRA with respect to their licenses, and community coalitions is probably an avenue in that regard. And jump in if anything I'm saying sounds right or wrong, if anyone in there. But I think that for the purposes of this evening, the CBAs are about new developments taking place and how to interject community voice with respect to new developments that are sort of taking place. And that's not to devalue that really pressing issue that you're raising. But I think that might fall under settlement agreements and interactions with the ANC and other community members.
So it's now a binding contract for brand new developers?
Yes, yeah, for brand new developers. And I do want to make sure we get through, if we didn't answer your question, we're happy to talk more towards the end and make sure we get through a few more questions. I have a question. I just wanted to roll together. Let me,
Why don't we just, Ms. Manning, we have a few questions that have been waiting in the chat box. If you don't mind, we might try to get to them first, at least the ones that we can get to before the second half of the presentations. And if you do have questions, please do place in the chat box, and we can stay even after 7:30 or 8 to answer them for you. But we also anticipate that some of these questions will also be answered during the second portion of the presentation. One I wanted to address was Ms. Strauss's question about, can you give an example of how CBAs have elevated special interests? Lynn, I don't know if you wanted to give some color to that question or what you had said under the obstacle slide.
Yeah, so we don't want to name names, but in some of the CBAs that we've looked at, we have seen times where maybe one or two organizations really kind of were the primary or only negotiators with a developer, and ultimately ended up getting pretty much all of the benefits that were secured through the CBA. And so with that, there's a couple things that can happen. I mean, one, other members of the community who made an CBA with, and in some cases, CBA with a developer, which can sort of just disrupt the whole process, that kind of just to commitment from the community. And from the developer's perspective, oftentimes what we hear is developers want to negotiate with kind of a united community because they don't want to be negotiating multiple CBAs at a time, because that just sort of ends up being difficult for them. And so it really is beneficial to bring together a diverse group.
Lynn, you're freezing up a little bit, so why don't we get back to you on that question? I think the gist of what you're saying is the special interest examples has been generally when you have one or two individuals on behalf of an entire community. And then there's not always great communication between that individual, whether it's an ANC or the member of it, the head of attendance association or someone else, and the other community members who are being impacted. And then you get to a lot of internal politics within the community. And that's one of the challenges. And that's one of the things we want to make sure encourage when you have diverse coalitions. And I think let's just take one more question, maybe from the chat box, which is the question, Ms. Waldeck, about how do you know what amount of funds to negotiate for? We will address that in the second portion of the presentation, as well as figuring out the extent of profits anticipated by the developer. Ms. Manning, did you want to raise your question really quickly?
Yeah, really quick. Thank you so much. So my question was, it sounds like that the CBA is dependent upon a strong relationship with the ANCs and ANC Council and the community and to help leverage an agreement with the developer. So also it's also from what you mentioned, that a CBA could be negotiated so with the ANC board, so that any future developments will have to abide by any CBA that is any CBA template that's put in place. Did I hear that correctly?
No, if I could clarify really quickly. So the template we're talking about is, so this is the process. So in terms of the ANC board, what happens is when there's a development project coming down the pipeline, the developer usually reaches out to the ANC in that particular jurisdiction or the single member district, SMD. And that ANC usually starts the conversation either with other ANCs or the ANC chair, if it's not the same person, or a coalition of community stakeholders in whatever community it is. And then they kind of go to the drawing table or the negotiating table with the developers with the lists of asks, right? A very kind of broad level list of asks. And what we say about, well, we mentioned a framework for CBAs, what we're referring to there is rather than start the process over and over again every time there is a new development, because CBAs are project specific, there's no one CBA that it applies to an entire jurisdiction or all projects within a jurisdiction. That CBA framework can be a cheat sheet of sorts for the ANCs and other negotiators to start the process for what the community priorities are. And I'm speaking really quickly because I'm trying to compete with the sirens that are coming at my street. But I don't know if that answers your question, but we can certainly return to it during the second half of the portion of the presentation if we need more elaboration. Does that work?
Yes, we can discuss it further at the second half. Thank you so much.
Raleigh, I'll turn it back to you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much to Jennifer and to everybody else for your questions. Obviously, those that we were not able to get to quite yet, we will get to at the end. And please, as always, feel free to put additional questions in the chat box. So let us proceed to the second half of the presentation, where I think we will answer a number of questions that have or may be raised. So as we've mentioned, Jennifer, Dave, as we've mentioned, we have interviewed over 36 local experts about their experience developing CBAs. And from these conversations, we've collected some best practices across 3 key stages of the CBA life cycle. The first stage is building a strong and diverse coalition. The second is negotiating the CBA with the developer. And the third is the follow-through, overseeing and enforcing the developer's commitments. So let's begin with the first stage. So we've frequently heard that building a strong and diverse coalition is key to an effective CBA. It's important that the coalition's voice is louder than just the ANCs. Here are a few recommendations for coalition building. First, connect with existing community networks. Second, reach out to individuals and organizations that have technical expertise. And we've frequently heard that one of the biggest challenges is a knowledge and resource gap between community coalitions and developers. By reaching out to organizations with technical knowledge, coalitions can begin to narrow that gap. For example, as David mentioned when discussing key players, the DC Fiscal Policy Institute assisted the coalition that negotiated a CBA for the DC United Stadium in Southwest DC. Additionally, many practitioners have told us that they talk to friends and neighbors who have other health professional skills, for example, lawyers who might be able to help look at contract language within CBAs. Having these technical experts in the room, like people with knowledge of housing finance or housing policy, can also help communities identify which benefits are most feasible to negotiate for. And finally, bring in other local stakeholders who may be directly affected by the new development. Developers know they need broad community support, and so they'll be much more likely to negotiate with the coalition that is actually representative of a community. For example, the entertainment sports arena CBA reached out to, I'm so sorry, my chair, reached out to 33 organizations, including some of the organizations you see on your screen. We also heard from a Ward 7 ANC that he'd like to bring as many people as possible with him to his first meeting with the developers, kind of as a show of strength. So it's best to bring your entourage. We also recommend providing clear roles and structure in a community coalition. There are a few different ways coalitions have achieved this. Some, like the SA CBA, utilized a community quarterback model. This model works by designating a single group to facilitate the coalition's decision-making efforts and to communicate with the developer. For example, in the SA CBA, the Congress Heights Community Training and Development Corporation acted as the community quarterback by facilitating the roles of all the other players. Other coalitions, like the one that formed around the Progression Place CBA, have added internal structure by adopting a steering committee made up of coalition members. Like the community quarterback model, steering committees can be responsible for representing the coalition's interests, identifying the benefits most sought after by the community, and negotiating with the developer. And coalitions have also found it helpful to create subcommittees or working groups to further divide decision-making and other responsibilities among coalition members. For example, DSA CBA created working groups to focus specifically on issues like education and workforce development. So as mentioned before, CBAs can be used to accomplish longer-term community goals, but identifying those goals requires soliciting two different kinds of community input: long-term and project-specific. Identifying long-term community goals requires intentional planning from a community well before a specific CBA is in the picture. Progression Place CBA is a really good example of this. There, the community organization 1DC had already spent years speaking with neighborhood residents to identify what they hoped to get out of future development. That experience formed the foundation of 1DC's demands during that CBA process. To identify project-specific goals, we recommend facilitating discussions and conducting outreach. For example, the organizers behind the ESA CBA relied on Ward 8 ANC meetings to connect with members of the community, but also used social media platforms, email campaigns, and robocalls. Next, the coalition should determine what specific benefits to demand from the developer. Once again, the coalition does not need to start from scratch, and I do hope that you're sensing a theme here. This is a matter of translating the mix of long-term and project-specific priorities identified through community planning and outreach into a set of concrete deliverables. Here's a list of some of the types of benefits that communities have frequently secured through CBAs. As you can see, there's a lot of variety, and this list is by no means exhaustive. The ESA CBA achieved this by delegating responsibility for identifying those community benefits to a series of working groups that identified a top 10 wish list. They identified and eventually succeeded in obtaining benefits like youth scholarships, business development and support, and community initiative funding. So these were some best practices for community coalition building. I will now pass to Lynn, who will discuss some best practices for obtaining the benefits and amenities identified by a community at the negotiation stage.
Thanks, Raleigh. So after forming the coalition and identifying specific CBA terms that are important to the community, the next stage of the CBA process is to actually negotiate the terms of the agreement with the developer. After a community coalition comes together, it needs to get the developer to the table. In some cases, the developer approaches an ANC or community organization directly to negotiate a CBA, but oftentimes it's the other way around. But regardless of who approaches whom, the coalition has to convince the developer that it deserves to be taken seriously as a negotiating partner. The developer begins the process with community practitioners. The developer begins the process with a set of built-in advantages, including those that we have listed here. Based on our conversations with community practitioners, we've identified a few ways that a coalition can demonstrate its power to the developer. And so these include building a political network, like enlisting the support of a council member, testifying at public hearings to show the developer that the coalition is both broad and well prepared to rally opposition to the project if there's not a CBA, embarking on a media campaign to rally public support for a CBA. This is something that community coalitions for the Progression Place and Entertainment and Sports Arena CBAs both did. And holding public demonstrations as a means of further pressuring the developer into addressing the coalition's concerns and negotiating a CBA. Taken together, these techniques can even out the asymmetry of bargaining power between the community coalition and the developer and motivate the developer to sit down and negotiate. Our interviews have told us that one of the most important aspects of CBA negotiations is how the actual terms of the CBA are written. The terms need to be specific and measurable. So terms that are specific and measurable will answer 5 questions: who, what, where, when, and how. So to illustrate this, I'm going to compare two terms from 2 different CBAs to show this. So here is a term from the CBA that the DC government negotiated with Walmart several years ago. The CBA stipulates that Walmart will work closely with the city government in its efforts to assist in building increased capacity for DC local businesses. Put simply, this is an ineffective term. First of all, it is vague. It doesn't say exactly what Walmart will do or how it will do it. It's not clear what it means for Walmart to, quote unquote, work closely or to assist. And the outcome is just this very general goal to increase capacity, which doesn't put any enforceable responsibilities on Walmart. It's also not measurable. It doesn't specify when Walmart should accomplish this goal or how someone could tell whether or not Walmart has ever kept its promise. But by contrast, I will show you a well-written term from the Entertainment and Sports Arena CBA. So here the CBA provides that Events DC will provide $60,000 per year for 19 years, totaling just over $1.1 million for scholarships for Ward 8 youth. There's additional language that specifies what the scholarships should be used for, like vocational training, college degrees. So we have the who, what, where, when, and why. So just to show kind of quickly, who is that event is Events DC. They'll provide the funding. The agreement also lists specific local nonprofit organizations that will administer the scholarship funds beyond just the text we have listed here. It says what they need to do, which is provide the funding for scholarships. It says when they need to do it, annually for 19 years. It specifies where, because this is specific to Ward 8 residents. And it also shows how, through distribution to specific local organizations that will administer the funds. So this term is specific because it says exactly what Events DC needs to do, and it's measurable because it says exactly how much money Events DC needs to contribute, how often, and for how long. I'll now hand things back to David to discuss overseeing follow-through for the CBA.
Thanks, Lynn. So the CBA becomes legally binding when both the developer and the coalition agree to terms and sign the agreement. When it comes to signing the CBA, we recommend designating at least one organizational member of the coalition as the signatory and ensuring that as many community participants who help negotiate the CBA can also sign the CBA. This is important because only the signatories to the agreement will have standing to enforce it in court if that becomes necessary. So in the Entertainment and Sports Arena CBA, for example, the coalition representing 33 member organizations signed the agreement as the ESA Community Benefits Coalition, which means that only the organizations and individuals who are members of that coalition have power to enforce the agreement in court. Next, we recommend getting the CBA incorporated into an order by a government agency. What that means is having the government issue an order saying that the developer doesn't get the approvals that they seek until they complete their CBA commitments. Incorporation allows the community coalition to take advantage of the government's capacity and resources for monitoring and enforcement. During our conversations with members of the Progression Place CBA coalition, one thing that we have heard repeatedly is that the CBA would have been easier to enforce if it could have been incorporated into an order by the Zoning Commission. Most CBAs in DC are executed in connection with PUD applications, many of which get incorporated into zoning orders. So finally, the project development begins and the community starts receiving benefits. This is where the implementation phase begins. For the purposes of implementing the specific terms of the CBA, we recommend forming an implementation committee. We have consistently heard from practitioners that oversight and implementation are some of the most challenging aspects of CBAs. So it's a good idea to designate a group of people whose responsibility it is to make sure that benefits are being delivered as promised. An implementation committee should include members from nonprofit and community groups, from every nonprofit and community group actually, that is supposed to receive benefits through the CBA. And this is partially because those groups are particularly motivated to make sure that the developer follows through, so their organizations can get what they were promised. And it is also partially because community groups have lower turnover rates than ANCs do, which helps with continuity and long-term enforcement. So, for example, the CBA for the Southwest Soccer Stadium created an implementation committee staffed by representatives from a neighborhood nonprofit. And what would this implementation committee do? An implementation committee's responsibilities include monitoring the developer's compliance with the CBA terms, dispersing benefits, for example, designating the recipients for a community benefit fund, and record keeping, such as sending the developer notices of potential breach and publishing progress reports, all of which can really help with transparency. We have found in our research that one of the most powerful tools for ensuring that a CBA is successful is maintaining an active relationship between the developer and the community coalition. And that's where the implementation committee comes into play, is keeping that relationship alive. But what do you do when the developer is not following through on their promises under the CBA? Our first recommendation is to have the implementation committee contact the developer, alert them to the defect, and give them the chance to get up to speed. That's part of why the relationship between the implementation committee and the developer is so important. If that falls through though, there are still a few more options. One is to ask the government agency that incorporated the CBA to enforce its terms against the developer. It's really important to note here, though, that the Zoning Commission can only enforce CBA terms that have to do with zoning and land use laws. Another avenue is to embark on a media campaign to bring public attention to the developer's lack of follow-through. Finally, there is the option to sue the developer for breach of contract. And two quick notes about this option, though. First, this has not yet been tried in court. And additionally, we want to reiterate the importance of having additional community entities sign onto a CBA, because ANCs cannot initiate litigation against the developer in their capacity as commissioners. They would have to rely on other community members to take that step.
Thank you, David. So recapping, what was that? So recapping the best practices for coalition building. We recommended bringing in additional local stakeholders, creating clear structure and roles, soliciting community input, and defining community asks. For negotiations, we recommended demonstrating coalition power and writing specific and measurable CBA terms. For the follow-through, we recommended designating a signatory or signing on as a coalition, incorporating the CBA into a government order, and forming an implementation committee. Finally, we recommended enforcing the CBA by alerting the developer, lobbying the government to enforce the CBA, embarking on a media campaign, or as a last resort, taking the developer to court. This brings us to the question of what community leaders can do right now. Our recommendation is to approach the idea of CBA coalitions as a proactive rather than a reactive process. That means, for one thing, start connecting with other community stakeholders right now. In other words, continue what you are already doing today. That way, when the opportunity arises to negotiate a CBA, you won't have to start from scratch because you'll already have a coalition ready to bring together. Similarly, we recommend that communities interested in a CBA start soliciting community input about what assets you value and which resources, benefits, and amenities you would like to see prioritized and reflected in a future CBA. And with that, we conclude the formal portion of our presentation. As we mentioned earlier, we are currently finalizing a number of CBA-related resources for the community in the next few months. We plan to make them available on the Harrison Institute's website, and we'll also email this group once each of these resources become available. In August, we released a CBA 101 fact sheet for residents so that community leaders can help share information about how CBAs work and get community buy-in early on. We can share that by email with this group if any of you are interested. Looking ahead to this winter, we'll be releasing a CBA report and best practices. It may surprise you given the length of our presentation, but there's a lot more information in our report than we were able to communicate today. We'll be releasing case studies on select CBAs in Washington, DC. You'll be releasing a model CBA template with some suggested language for enforcement, as David mentioned, what feels like a few hours ago. And we'll also be releasing a CBA database, which is currently being created and is an ongoing collaboration with the Office of ANCs. This is aimed to help increase transparency about what has been negotiated in DC, by whom, and for which projects. And with that, we have now wrapped up our formal presentation for the evening. We hope that we've answered the questions that you shared in the survey, and we'll be happy to answer any additional questions you may have at this time.
That was fantastic. Jennifer, how do you want to handle questions? Do you need help reading them off the chat, or?
Why don't I read them off and I'll just delegate them to a student. So
okay, great.
You guys stand at the ready. So let me bear with us for a moment. I think we had a question about where we can find information about CBAs that have been, is there an online resource for reviewing past and currently active CBAs like a CBA archive? Raleigh, did you want to take that?
Sure. So at least to my knowledge, there is not right now, but I think that Jennifer is leading me to plug our database that will be released this coming winter. It is, there's a lot of information in it, and it contains a large number of CBAs from around DC, and hopefully everyone will be able to get the information they need off of that.
So Raleigh is being humble. Raleigh has been hard at work over this past summer, compiling a list of CBAs that you see here, including the, starting with the Florida Avenue CBA on down. We have Raleigh, about a list of 30 some CBAs that we've collected over the course of the past few months, with identifying information like, which ward it was, the developers, a description of the project site that it was associated with. We try to identify the signatories, so not just who negotiated, but who actually signed on the dotted line. The community representatives that were at the negotiating table. We outline the developer obligations, for example, community service resources and what was included in the zoning agreement. Obligations from the community, very often this is in the form of public support. Any government obligations, if appropriate, to that CBA, as well as the timeline for how the CBA was negotiated from beginning to end. We mentioned if the CBA was eventually incorporated into a municipal document like a zoning commission order. We try to flesh out the implementation as far as we understand it. What is the status of the delivery of the benefits and amenities? An update on monitoring enforcement. And then some notes on kind of the outcome if there is some lessons to be learned from that as well. And then we also try to incorporate the additional resources as well as the full text of the CBA in a PDF form where possible. Again, this is a resource that is very much still in development, and we have been working with Gail Fast at the Office of ANCs, who I think is going to help us find some of the older CBAs that are probably in an ANC's basement somewhere, because a lot of these CBAs have not been digitized, and that's one of the challenges of getting all this information to you all. But a little bit of information is better than no information, and technically this is all public information because these are developed by your ANCs. So once we have this ready, we will share with you this information, which again will be from, I think, on Harrison's website. Fingers crossed. Next question. David, this is for you from Paul. In the Walmart example, did DC government and which agency enter into both a developer agreement and a CBA agreement? Can you clarify that point?
Yes, that's a really good question. The answer is actually no, because in the Walmart development, there wasn't any kind of discretionary disposition of public land. So that kind of obviated the need for a development agreement. And so basically the way that CBA really worked was that then Mayor Vincent Gray's administration, I think through DemPed, negotiated a CBA for basically like on behalf of the whole district for the development of 6 Walmart stores. And so that agreement was basically was really the only like community benefit promising contract between any community representative and the developer. There was no development agreement involved, and just that one, again, negotiated by DevHead, but we're pretty sure that it was signed on behalf of the entire mayoral administration.
Paul, in response to your question, there has been staff turnover at the leadership level at the Office of ANCs. I think they are having a new interim director in. Gottlieb Simon, I think, has retired. And I think that's one of the reasons Gail Fast reached out to us over the summer, wanting to make sure that she has some support on this database. So we'll make sure to provide that. The next question is from Bobby King. In the case of designating a member of the CBA coalition, what happens in the case of having to change the representative due to death, resignation, or termination of term, assuming the designee is an ANC or the individual moving from a neighborhood? That's a great question. I think something that we've asked others as well. Lynn, did you want to take this question?
Okay, I'm sorry. Which question were we on there again? I think I had it.
A question about what happens when there's a turnover, either in the ANC representative or someone is out in the CBA coalition. How do you maintain continuity?
Yeah, so a few ways we've seen this addressed. I mean, so generally when an ANC is involved, if the ANC turns over, you can write that into the agreement that another ANC would have the ability to enforce that. But also, one of the things that we've found is really helpful in this regard is having some of the parties be not just individuals, but organizations. So for example, a civic organization or a nonprofit. And so you might have the director or some other legal representative from that organization sign the agreement. But then if they turn over, if they're gone, then someone else from that organization would be able to maintain kind of the ability to enforce that agreement. But generally you can write this just into the agreement. However, since it's a contract, you can.
Sorry, Lynn. We will wait for her to unelectrocute herself or whatever is going on your end. Let's go on to the next question. Do developers in the future need to stick to past CBA frameworks? Raleigh, do you want to answer that? This is a question from Ms. Manning again.
Yes, by past CBA frameworks, do you mean that they have to stick with the commitments and obligations from prior CBAs that they have negotiated, or that they have to, in future CBAs, I guess, do them in a similar fashion to past CBAs?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the framework side that we talked about, certainly the framework is not legally binding. Our framework is just a starting point to talk about community priorities that they want to see eventually reflected in the CBA itself. But if you're talking about whether there should be continuity of the agreement, one, for example, I think someone mentioned if the developer, the property changes owners or changes hands, or how do you maintain continuity on the developer side? I think, David, did you want to answer Ms. Waldeck's question on that?
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. So Ms. Waldeck posted a question in the chat, I see, about what happens when CBAs are included in a BZA order. And question one is whether an order can be attached with the lot, so that when the lot changes hands, whether the terms can still be enforced. And the second is years after an order, when a past zoning exception is no longer needed, whether the CBA terms are still enforceable. The answer to both of those is yes, because CBAs can bind successive owners of a particular parcel or property. And I think I see where some of the lack of clarity comes from, and that's that CBAs and zoning variances are not one and the same. That zoning variances create an opportunity to negotiate a CBA, but they are technically standalone, like standalone things. So whereas a zoning variance is only necessary to be obtained by like one developer when they're initially building a property, and it's not really applicable to future owners of the property, and with changes in larger zoning regulations in the comp plan, that variance may no longer be needed. But separately, a CBA can require the owner and their successors to a particular property to fulfill obligations related to community benefits. And so in that way, stuff like recurring benefits like annual donations or streetscape improvements, reserving commercial space at below market rates, what have you, all of those terms can continue to apply even if ownership of a property changes hands. So yeah, so we've seen plenty of CBAs where the text explicitly lays out that obligations on a developer refer not just to the developer, but also to their tenants and their lessees within a commercial development. And if the developer sells the property, then whoever they sell it to also needs to follow through with their obligations. So the bottom line is that CBAs can definitely be continuous on the owners of a particular project or development.
And David, have you come across case studies, and this is in response to Ms. Edwards' question, if the developer goes bankrupt, what is the standing of the parties to the CBA? Is the agreement terminated?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I cannot think off the top of my head of any examples that we've seen of a CBA with a developer that went bankrupt before they were done with their obligations. I can definitely look that up, and we can certainly get back to you. But I really don't know off the top of my head what happens in that kind of scenario.
I think a closer example we had, David, is the Walmart example, right? The Walmart, well, this was not quite the CBA under our definition of a CBA, which is between the community and the developer. And Walmart, it was more again with Ray's administration, so the city and Walmart. When the contracts were subsequently canceled, then there came the question of what happens to the CBA. So that did come up in the Walmart context, right?
Yes. Oh, thank you for reminding me. That's a really good example. So that wasn't quite a bankruptcy, but what happened there was that Walmart was planning to open up 6 stores in DC, and a lot of their obligations under this CBA had to do with like commercial development in the specific neighborhoods where they were going to develop. And after they opened 3 stores, they said that basically conditions in the DC marketplace had changed. It was no longer financially a good idea for them to develop any more stores. So they said that they just straight up weren't going to fulfill their commitment that they'd made in the CBA to develop all 6 stores and promote commercial development in all 6 of those neighborhoods. So basically what happened was the DC Attorney General's office started looking into and started preparing a case essentially to sue Walmart on contract grounds for failure to fulfill its commitments under the CBA. And in the end, the case was not adjudicated in court, but it did result in a huge settlement agreement wherein Walmart paid a, I think, $3 million settlement to the district government. And in return, the DC government agreed not to try to pursue its ability to litigate or sue on their behalf. So that's an example of when a developer basically like promises certain things and then they lose the financial stability necessary to follow through, and so then they back out. Like that does create opportunities to, if not enforce the terms, then at least like bring an action that will get some kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? Some kind of restitution for the community to make them whole and make up for some of the difference. I hope that answers everyone's questions on that.
Are there more questions in the chat, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think you have a question. which
Yeah, I don't know if it makes sense. You want me
Yeah.
to try to-
So yeah, what if a community coalition is active but has no standing in zoning/municipal judicial forums, coupled with an ANC who's indifferent or shirking its responsibility to even engage in the CBA process? I hope you're not talking about yourself. In this hypothetical, can the ANC be bypassed? David, Raleigh, Lynn, do you want to take a stab at this question? So what happens if the ANC is not as involved in the development process? Are there examples of CBAs where other groups have led the discussion or the negotiations?
So there are examples like the Southwest Soccer CBA where the ANC allowed community coalition to essentially lead negotiations for the CBA with the developer. But the specifics of the question, who is indifferent or shirking, I am honestly not sure. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. David, if you can help me out with that, great. But in terms of can the ANC be bypassed? My understanding is that, well, technically a CBA can be negotiated between just the community organization and a developer without the ANC and the great weight that is afforded to an ANC. It's much more difficult to essentially enforce, and it's much more difficult to actually negotiate, I would say, in a equitable fashion. The ANC and their great weight is one of the, if not the most, one of the most important aspects of CBA negotiation. David, do you have an example I'm not thinking of?
So one thing I'm thinking of, Raleigh, is hopefully I won't get kicked off while I'm talking this time, but I'll try while I'm here. I can think of examples where honestly, the community coalition was more powerful than the ANC was. And so in those cases, yeah, the community coalition really led the charge. I mean, it's, as Raleigh said, like, it's going to be harder if the ANC is actively opposing the community groups. That would certainly be kind of the worst case scenario, but I feel like there is one that I just can't place in my mind right now where maybe that did happen, but there's nothing in the process. I mean, ultimately the CBA is a private agreement. So there's nothing that structurally prohibits a community group from being able to negotiate a CBA with the developer if the ANC is not involved. So you absolutely can. It's just going to be easier if you can get the ANC on board, at least not to actively oppose you, but because that could just, it may be that the zoning commission is willing to approve a project if the ANC is on board. And that might just sort of get rid of your bargaining power with the developer. But if you can show, if a community group can show that they're going to be able to, put up enough of a fuss to, halt development in some way, then the developer's probably going to respond to that and showing up to, I mean, with Progression Place, the community groups, 1DC there was really the most vocal piece there. And in some cases, they did disagree with the ANCs about what benefits to negotiate. And so they kind of went forward with their own interests and negotiated separately in some cases.
I think a question related to that from Ms. Waldeck again is, have any of the mainstream organizations negotiated CBAs without including the ANC or other community organizations in your audit? And I can just very quickly say that several of the CBAs we've come across, including the Deanwood Citizens Association CBA, to name a few, were signed without the ANC's signature, or as far as we can tell, their robust involvement. So again, it depends on the organization, how much traction they already have with developers on the ground, and kind of how much in the know the ANC has around CBA. So there are cases of, it's not impossible for an ANC to not be involved in a CBA. David, you had a follow-up question about, thanks for the Walmart example, what happened to the $3 million? Did it go to the community?
Thank you for that. So first of all, I need to clarify, I misspoke. It was, I'm double checking my sources now, and it was actually a $1.3 million settlement, not a $3 million settlement. So apologies for that small error. And secondly, we have not been able to identify where the settlement money went. We've interviewed some of the community organizations that were involved in the campaign for a CBA, and whatever happened with the settlement money, they were not looped in on it. So this is an example. This shows the need for transparency and for grassroots organizations to actually get involved in CBAs and CBA enforcement, is because they are much more likely to be transparent. And in that regard, I also want to quickly highlight the example of the Line Hotel in Adams Morgan, which was another example of litigation involved in a CBA or CBA adjacent process. So several years ago in Adams Morgan, the developers of the Line Hotel tried to bypass the community engagement process and avoid signing a CBA. And following that, a neighborhood coalition led by the Champlain Neighborhood Association, they filed a lawsuit, and in the end, they also acquired a settlement from the developers. And what they did with that was they took the settlement money and they put it into a community benefits fund whose uses were going to be determined by a resident-led group. And I think I want to point that out because I think that's an example of a much more productive and transparent and democratically accountable way for litigation to end up getting restitution that then can be put towards some of the uses that a CBA otherwise would have. So the final answer is that the DC government was not very transparent on the Walmart settlement, but we would point people to the Line Hotel incident for a better example.
Thanks, David, for the clarification. Parisa, Paul, I think we have one last set of questions from Reggie Black. Do we have time for that? Okay. Reggie, we're answering your questions now. My question is, can you describe metric reporting involved in CBAs, and could you give some examples? And it's a compound question. So the second part of the question is, are there examples of CBAs that may have negatively impacted a community? Lynn, do you want to take a stab at that? I think you were the one that was talking about metrics and specific examples of metric reporting in CBAs.
Yes, I will try as long as my internet will allow me to. So metric reporting, it varies widely. I mean, some CBAs honestly don't call for any reporting, which we wouldn't recommend. But other CBAs do provide for more regular reports. Sometimes it's in the form of maybe a quarterly report or an annual report. Sort of depends on what kind of benefits you're asking for. If you have benefits that are going to continue to be delivered for 20 years, having a group that puts together an annual report could be really helpful. Some CBAs specifically have kind of a monitoring and implementation committee that's responsible for collecting information from the developer and where appropriate, collecting information from other groups, perhaps nonprofits that are receiving funds through the CBA, so that they can report on the distribution of those funds or the status of, a project that was negotiated through the CBA. And then that information can be made publicly available. It's one of our best practices, and some CBAs do require this sort of report to be published online or otherwise made publicly available. But that's definitely an area where I think it really is helpful to just lay that out in the terms of the agreement. because it's something that we found in trying to do this research. It actually can be really hard to figure out what the status of a lot of these benefits are. And so trying to think through that ahead of time and lay that out in the agreement is really helpful. And then it also gives you a point where you can come back and if the developer hasn't followed through on something, and you can kind of use that to help hold their feet to the fire if you need to. I don't know if that totally answers your question. Happy to answer more if you'd like.
Great. If that's the last question, I know we're almost at 8 o'clock. Thank you for broad-based discussion. Always the best discussions create more questions. So looking forward to development tools and rolling out some of this knowledge. And we're happy. So thank you again, Harrison Institute, Georgetown, for bringing your expertise. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Riley. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone. And as far as Empower, we're excited about Award 4 focus on activities such as this, skill building, capacity building. And we have a few events coming up, one on Saturday that perhaps Parisa, can you speak to?
Yeah, just real briefly, the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition is meeting this Saturday. Those who have been following the whole comprehensive plan amendment process, there's new policies around incorporating a racial equity lens in planning and zoning. And so far, the Office of Planning has not implemented that. And they're sort of moving forward, business as usual. So we're working on pushing that and pushing it in a meaningful way. So join us on Saturday. If you're interested in that topic, you can look at our social media to get all the details. It's at 1 o'clock on Zoom. And for the Ward 4 group, just, to reiterate some of what Paul said earlier, Empower DC is a citywide organization. So we have members in all wards. We have campaigns, but we also have members who are just interested in doing more at the neighborhood and ward level to promote equitable development. So that might be engaging more in city planning, engaging around surplus properties, helping tenants in at-risk properties, preserve their housing, et cetera. So this is the beginning of some of that work. And if there are folks on the call who are interested in learning more about that, feel free to reach out to me or Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night. Bye.